Today is World Religion Day. Did you know that? It's on my Zen wall calendar. I saw it, and I actually noticed that the American bishops made a statement today about it, so few people are noticing it. So it's a good time to continue or to conclude with Bernadette Roberts' experience, the experience of no self that I talked about last week, because here, and I did go through some of her attitudes towards world religions previously from her previous book, The Path to No Self, but she has some more in here which is interesting, worth discussing. In the questions and comments that I referred to, section that I referred to last week, she does have a whole section on, I was asked, with the falling away of my Christian contemplative frame of reference, so I did not seek help from other religious or philosophical traditions. Now remember, she had the experience of radical no self, and she didn't find it talked about in Christian contemplative literature. She's Catholic herself, and didn't, really explore Buddhism. She says the answer is that I did look for help, but search for other life preservers. Now it's interesting she uses that word or that phrase. I can see what she means, that the life preservers are tools, things to keep you afloat, as you go along, to help you on your journey as you're being carried by the torrent. But in a sense, it's better to think of them as, things that help you drown. Because you want to drown, So, tools to make you go under, I was not familiar with the Eastern disciplines and found their paradigms and terminologies quite foreign. Well, okay, some do. It's not for everybody. I could never get hold of their notion of reincarnation, which is not central, or karma, which is not central. Illusion, that's central, and so on. Nor could I ever have had their own understanding of self, or Atman in the Hindu tradition. Though I doubt any of this would have been useful to me in the past. It was too late now. I wouldn't want to, as she says, it may sound easy to change directions in midstream, but I don't see how it is possible after going this far. Now, it is true that you need to take whatever tradition you're in, and usually your birth tradition, really seriously and fully engage with it. But to find help, double belonging, to find nourishment from other traditions, and even to practice them, as I'm doing and that you're doing, presumably, that's not changing, directions in midstream. It's just continuing, but are they life preservers? When we hit the rapids, as she says, it's not the time to step out and study the structure of other life preservers. Well, you're not studying the structure, you're doing it. You actually have to practice, that's true. That may or may not tame the stream for us. Well, I hope they don't tame the stream for you. No. This is true, though. It seems the very nature of the crossing is an unhinging of every idea or belief we cling to regarding the structure of the world, self, and God. Yes, that's right. An unhinging for which there are no substitutes, no life preservers, indeed, and no changing in midstream. No. Okay, we're not talking about that. She said, if I had any life preserver at all, it was nature itself. And that's very good. So reality itself, nature itself is, as we said, the first Bible is the first, it's where we find reality. You don't bypass the material world or creation to get to the spirit, which is usually just an abstraction up there, or projection if you don't go through the real, which is what Zen always does and what we should always do too. The flower or the tree or whatever it might be, as we said last week. The fantastic design of my peacock friend was there in my direst moments. I'm not sure whether she means an actual peacock or just, seeing a peacock, on a picture or something. But that's true. When you have something as splendid as that, just wow. I mean, you're not going to bypass that, surely, in your search for reality. Now, early in the journey, while reading a book by Thomas Merton, a Christian contemplative monk, I came across the Buddhist notion of no self, which of course what she actually calls, and followed up this important discovery by reading several books in that frame of reference. Reading books, however, will never lend verification for an experience outside their own frame of reference. That's the danger. or the limitation. Realize that every frame of reference, even the religious frame of reference, is a frame of reference. In the end, you have to let all frames of reference go. So to seek more understanding and clarification, I spent a week at a Zen monastery, where I told them in all honesty I had come to find out how I might ascertain, according to their own tradition, if I had any self left or not. I asked them to please explain to me what remained when self was gone. Well, you know how they answered. My questions must have seemed naive to them, for the silence I met seemed to indicate these questions were a monastic taboo. There was no discussion, no explanation, no answers, and consequently no help. Well, of course not. If someone comes to me or to any Zen teacher and says, explain to me the self, what's the experience? I'd say, that's what I'd say. Nothing. I'd say practice and find out. Find out for yourself. So I don't disagree with the way they replied to her, nor do I misunderstand her question. I get it. So once again, I was forced back upon my own resources, which were growing scantier every day. Now, in all fairness, she says, I admit to meeting a similar silence when I sent a note to my hermit friends in Big Sur, the Camaldolese, telling them I would give $1 to any monk who could tell me where self left off and God began. Needless to say, I didn't lose a penny. They couldn't do it because, first of all, you can't talk about it, and second, it's not in the Catholic Christian literature. That's her whole complaint, Without a doubt, when her time comes, every woman must go it alone. Indeed. And kudos to her for doing it, following just her experience. Perhaps the only philosophy or theology that can help us cross the stream, she says, is one that admits when you've learned it all and lived it thoroughly, then you'd better get ready to have it all collapse when you discover the highest wisdom is that you know nothing. Amen. And then she quotes the famous example of St. Thomas Aquinas, which you've probably, hopefully heard before, but if not, here it is. After writing his masterful tomes on Christian theology, the Summa Theologica and all of that, suddenly he had an experience of God that so silenced his mind that ever after he never wrote a single word. He didn't finish the Summa because he said everything he had written was straw. So you see, theology, what good is it? Well, in the end, thus even St. Thomas literally fell outside his own frame of reference. Indeed, when he came upon that, quotes, that, which no mind can comprehend nor pen describe. But here we all stuck with all those tomes, she says, that cannot enable us to see what he saw, and to which we cannot cling if we're to do so. Very well said. It seems that ultimately we must go beyond all frames of reference when the cloud of unknowing, she uses the phrase, which we use in centering prayer, the cloud of unknowing descends, and goes back to Gregory of Nyssa and Moses on Sinai, and the Transfiguration. All the thrashing around looking for life preservers won't do a bit of good. What she says now is interesting for bringing the traditions together. However, I now see a possible line of travel that may be of use before crossing the stream. It would be to start with the Christian experience of self's union with God, whereby we lose the fear of ever becoming lost, since we can only get lost in God. Now, I remember a few weeks ago I said that I've come over the years to the preference that a person on the journey has some kind of bhakti experience before just going into the void. In other words, from whatever tradition, Hindu or Christian or Islamic or Jewish, that there's a sense of being the beloved of an absolute reality, that there's a kind of a personal quality to it and a surrender. Otherwise, the danger is that you'd never really lose the self, which of course you do when you love. So anyway, that's just a proposition there. And that's what she says too. She says, this is done with the help of Christ, the ever-present guru or master who, unlike other mediums, is always around when you need him. True enough. And sincere seekers of every tradition will encounter Christ by name or not. And I verified that with seekers. both in the stillness within and in the silence of the Eucharist, for example. But when the self disappears forever into this great void, capital letters, we come upon the Buddhist discovery of no self. So that is where you go, and that's what Buddhism has helped me and others to do, because it's not talked about in Christianity, is the no self. And learn how to live without anything we could possibly call a self, she says, and without a frame of reference. And that's the thing. Thomas Keating said this at the end of his life, that self is any fixed point of reference. So any fixed point of reference, any frame of reference, as she calls it, we have to get beyond. As we come upon the essential oneness of all that is. After this, we come to the peak of Hindu discoveries, she says, namely the identity of the one ultimate existent, Brahman, that is all that is. All, of course, but the self, because the self isn't. So the ultimate can't be that. Nor can you not being the self, but. So there's only the one in the end. And this does come close to, there are certain Sufi mystics, who interpret La ilaha illa Allah, that there's no God but Allah, as being there's nothing but Allah. There's only God. And of course they get into trouble in their tradition the same way Christians get into trouble in our tradition when we say things like that. But you're not saying you're God because you aren't there anymore. Or even the Shema, the great prayer of Judaism, Hear Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. God, Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's basically saying there's just the one. That's it. It's not just saying he's the only God. He's saying there's only that, which is what she's saying here. Interesting. I'm not a scholar of religion, East or West. And although I know each religion feels it can ford the stream alone, and here she comes back to a position I more foster and favor. Even though I know each religion feels it can ford the stream alone, I think it far superior to ford it together. Me too. Because it is a difficult stream to cross no matter how well the life preservers are constructed. Theoretically, such an eclectic approach may be impossible. Theoretically, maybe, but not in practice. That's why the emphasis is on religious experience and not on religious dialogue about concepts. But after taking this journey, I'm convinced that on an experiential level, the pivotal truth of our major religions ultimately come together. Pivotal truth of our major religions ultimately come together. I totally agree. And it would be so wonderful if that is in fact the case. This at least seems to be the way the stream flows. Yes, there's just the flow. So there's a lot there, but I'd like also to go to the last pages of the whole book, the conclusion of the conclusion, when she brings up these issues again. And she says, the only mystic I know in the Christian tradition who says something about this step beyond union, beyond self and God, is Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Dominican. Now, those of you who know history about Zen in America know that D.T. Suzuki, the first Japanese to bring Zen, really into mainstream discussion in the early 20th century, pointed that out. He said, in your Western tradition, the person who's most Zen is Meister Eckhart. And then Thomas Merton picked that up as well, since he knew Suzuki. So that's very interesting, and I totally agree. Meister Eckhart got into trouble because he says beyond the Trinity and beyond the, is the Godhead, the one. And of course, theology says God is one. Even we do. It's not just three. God isn't three. But of course, he gets into trouble when he says there's a Godhead beyond the Trinity. But you see what he's getting at. He's getting to the oneness that we've just been talking about. That all the traditions are talking about, that experience is talking about. So he's speaking on the level of experience and not theology, which is what she says is the difficulty. We're crashing through, breaking forth into the Godhead, which is beyond the idea of God or truth, The beginning of beginnings, getting back to that, the origin or source of all goodness and truth. That's from a book on Meister Eckhart. So Meister Eckhart says, in this breakthrough I discover that I and God are one. It's beyond my own free will or the will of God and all the works, etc., above all creatures. God and I are one. And she quotes Thomas Aquinas, the creature in God is the divine essence itself. Now that means we, in the mind of God, what they call formally and eminently theological language, is divine essence itself. But that's, Thomas Aquinas wouldn't go quite so far as Meister Eckhart. As we see, so she explains how, of course, he incurred the censure of the church. Apparently, a few theologians were a little wary about all this talk of our essential oneness with God, since this is, after all, a theological taboo. But Eckhart never thought he saw anything contrary in his teaching to the doctrines of the church. On the experiential level, he had only penetrated the truth which theology attempts to define. So Eckhart picked up, so to speak, where St. Thomas Aquinas left off, when he not only expanded but become eloquent in the areas where his Dominican brother had fallen silent. So that's the system. It's regrettable that the Spanish mystics found it necessary to bring the descriptions of their experiences into conformity solely with the speculative Thomistic aspects of the contemplative life. In doing so, the Eckhartian dimension beyond union was lost and remains unaccounted for in their writings. True. To speak of an accidental oneness or union with God, not essential, is orthodox theology. But to speak of an essential oneness with God, a oneness in God's essence, is considered unorthodox, she says. The problem is not one of description or semantics, but one of experience. For with the falling away of the union of two, there remains only the clear identity of the one. The Rhineland mystics speak about this. Not on the Trinitarian distinctions, but the essential unity or oneness. And that's reflected in their journey, giving way to a unity without distinction, the essential oneness of the Godhead. So this is, obviously very Christian, but you see that it rejoins the experience that we're talking about. This is not recognized because it does not harmonize with the theological insistence on the essential and everlasting separation between creator and creature. Theological insistence. And she quotes here Étienne Gilson. Some of you may know he and Maritain were the great French commentators. He was head of the Medieval Institute in Toronto in the early 20th century, and he wrote many wonderful books on St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure. But he says, if you were to lower, even for an instant, and at any point, the barrier set up by the contingence of being between man and God, our contingent being, then you rob the Christian mystic of his God. And you rob him, therefore, of his mysticism. She goes on to say, exactly. That's what needs to happen. No more self, no more God, no more mysticism. And the contingent being, by the way, separated from infinite being as opposed to contingent being, a necessary being of God. And one of Roshi Kennedy's favorite quotes, which we've often talked about, from St. Thomas Aquinas, is when he says, there's no more being after creation than before. Because that can you add to infinite being. So what are we? What's contingent? What does that even mean? Which is exactly. This is good. So as I see it, the root of the problem stems from the belated biblical statement, not in Genesis, it's true, it's in Maccabees, that God made all things from nothing. This is a good way to approach it. Nothing. Nothing is the ultimate name for God in Jewish mysticism, in the Kabbalah. Ayin, the ultimate name for God is nothing. And of course, emptiness and nothingness in Buddhism. The crux of the disagreement between theologian and mystic lies in the interpretation of this nothing. Since absolute nothing is incomprehensible, it falls into the realm of the unknown. That this unknown is nothing is not God is the insistence of the theologian. That this unknowable nothing turns out to be God is the final realization of the mystic. So when you say you're making things out of nothing, you mean out of God, but not out of God like some material or something that I'm made out of this or paper mache or something. This doesn't make any sense, you say. It's crazy. Yes, of course it doesn't make any sense. If it made sense, it wouldn't be the experience we're aiming at. Thus, if we were created from nothing, it can only mean nothing knowable to the mind, which is the truth, since God's essence is unknowable. Yet the experiential understanding of how this works is possible once self has fallen away. So if you want to find out how this actually works, let the self fall away. Theology has no words for this essential oneness. How about this paragraph? And then we'll get to the final one. So however we wish to interpret the nothingness or non-being from which we were made. Oh, by the way, nothingness and non-being. On my wall calendar that I just mentioned, there are quotes from Shunryu Suzuki for this month of January is this. You have an idea of emptiness and an idea of being. And you think that being and emptiness are opposites. But with Buddhism, both of these are ideas of being. The emptiness we mean is not like the idea you may have. So the reality of emptiness and being are the same, which is what we're saying here. But not the idea of them. The idea of them there seem to be opposite. Nothing doesn't seem to be anything, but it isn't anything, it's no thing. You know what I'm saying. It's difficult to justify any speculation that God did not make us from himself, whereas the Platonists prefer his own mind, since this still does not make us God. Now, so you notice this? It doesn't make us God. Does not limit God to matter or to this universe, does not do away with creation, contingency, or change, anything at all. It doesn't conflict with any relevant Christian belief. We're not saying that creation doesn't exist, but that in the end there's just the oneness. Just like absolute is relative and emptiness is form and form is emptiness. That's exactly what Zen says as well. So it doesn't conflict with any Christian belief. And then in parentheses, if any, only the notion of eternal damnation might be affected by this. But who needs this? Certainly God doesn't. Amen to that. And I've given conferences on that. The idea that the created is, in its deepest essence, eternally separated from God is an idea that no contemplative or mystic could buy into. Instead, they see what the evangelist said, the first letter of John. All we know is that when our ultimate destiny is revealed, we shall be like him, like Christ. So however it is for Christ in the Godhead, so shall it be for us. That's a good rule of thumb. However it is for Christ in the Godhead, so shall it be for us. Or the Buddha, if you like. Why not? So she laments again that she hasn't been able to find this, talked about very much. The failure to find this movement beyond self in the classical contemplative literature. I see clearly that a dimension unmistakably exists beyond anything that could be described as the self's union with God, be it spiritual marriage, transforming union, whatever terminology. For the contemplative, to regard such a union as the final or ultimate consummation of the spiritual life is a grave mistake. He's setting his sight at a midpoint way too low, too narrow, too close in. Whenever possible, it's best to get beyond such a point, even when letting go means surrendering this union with all its experiences and qualities of strength and love and certitude and all that. For as long as there's any feeling, knowledge, or inkling that any self remains, be it a divine self, a true self, even, we have not gone far enough. And on the retreat that I was just on with Cynthia Bourgeot, she pointed that out, that in the end, the distinction false self, true self vanishes. There's only false self. There's no true self. Every self is false in the end, even the true one. any fixed point of reference, even one that that was true before, that vanishes too. Only God can lead us across this line into the unknown. In fact, self never crosses the line, it simply ceases to be. For if the truth be known, only Christ dies, and only Christ rises. And the Hindus and the Buddhists would express it somewhat differently, but the idea, the reality is there. Vitally important to realize that such a step exists, that others have taken it, and to be prepared so there will be no illusions about what lies beyond self. For us to give ourself to God is, as Eckhart says, to give him absolutely nothing. But for God to take the self is for him to take absolutely everything. Very well said. Though John of the Cross stresses the giving over the taking, I'm giving to God, Meister Eckhart stresses the taking over the giving, God takes myself away. The fact remains that no matter how we evaluate this exchange, there are two movements and two experiences. The second movement culminates in no union, no self, no God for that self. The reason for this is that in order to come upon God as he is in himself and not as he is in ourself, there must be no self. There's no other way. We're getting to the end here. This is the last paragraph. Someone said to me, "It sounds like you lost your soul." I'd never thought of it that way, yet I liked the idea because I always regarded the soul as God's habitat, a kingdom in which God and self dwell as an unbeatable team. Thus, to lose the soul, what could possibly be left? Certainly wouldn't be me or you. So what does it mean to lose your soul? And you know how Buddhism doesn't like to talk about soul at all. You can see why, obviously even more here. I think it means the death of God and self, the unitive state, a descent into hell, and a resurrection on the third day. That's what she said, and she said elsewhere in her work. That's what happened to Christ in the Triduum, the loss of self. No longer the union of him with the Father, but the complete loss of that. In heaven we do not speak of souls, we only speak of saints, so there may not be any souls in heaven, I don't know. Or Cynthia Bourgeois speaks of a developmental soul, which is a whole different proposition. But isn't this what Christ would have us do, lose our very life, our souls, that we might have eternal life? That's what it says in the gospel. He who seeks himself brings himself to ruin, whereas he who brings himself to naught, for me, discovers who he is. And the word in Greek there is the word for soul in the gospel. To this I would add that in coming to naught, we will only discover who we are, but what we are. Not only discover who we are, but what we are. For in God, these cannot be separated. That we are, what we are, who we are, where we are. In God, these are one with a capital O. And outside this one, nothing is.